So you've really given us a lot to think about with this overview of Great Britain. I mean, it is March 2025 as we're talking about this.
Right, yeah, March 2025.
It's fascinating, honestly. You've covered just so much. I mean, we're talking everything from the actual physical ground that Britain stands on to like the political struggles that are going on right now. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a pretty comprehensive picture.
So where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, I guess our mission here, if we can call it that, is to kind of break it all down,
Yeah,
to make it understandable, right? I mean, we don't want to just overwhelm everyone with a torrent of facts.
definitely. I think the goal is to extract what's most important. The things that will really help people grasp what's going on in Britain today.
Okay, so maybe we could start by sort of picking out some of the highlights. Like what are some of the things that really jumped out at you when you were putting all of this together?
Well, honestly, one of the first things that struck me was the geography.
The geography, okay.
It's easy to forget, I think, how much the land itself has shaped everything else. We're talking about an island nation,
Right.
and not just any island. We're talking over 11,000 miles of coastline.
11,000. Wow, that's a lot. More than I would have guessed.
It is, yeah. And that's not even counting all the inlets and everything. That kind of coastline, it's made Britain a maritime power,
Yeah.
throughout history. All those natural harbors, they allowed for a navy that could adapt and a trading network that just,
Yeah.
span the globe.
Right, yeah. You can't really understand British history without understanding its relationship to the sea, right?
Absolutely. But then on top of that, you've got the incredible diversity of the landscape itself. You've got the rolling hills, like down in the Cotswolds.
Mm.
Then you go up north and you've got Scottish Highlands, these dramatic mountains, and then there's the rugged coastline of Wales. It's so varied.
And those variations are not just like, pretty scenery. They've really affected how different parts of Britain have developed.
Exactly. They've shaped regional identities, economies. I mean, think about the rivers, too, like the Thames, the Severn, the Clyde. These have been the lifeblood of trade and the growth of towns and cities for centuries.
Okay, so the land is definitely a starting point. But I mean, you can't talk about geography without talking about the weather.
Oh, absolutely. And the weather in Britain's, it's a whole thing.
It is.
But it's not just the rain. I mean, that's there, of course.
Yeah.
But it's that temperate maritime climate that has really had a lasting impact.
Right, that's what it's called, temperate maritime.
Yeah, and it means that they can grow certain crops really well, like potatoes, oats, things that can handle a bit of damp and chill. It's also, in a way, shaped the culture. Like, think about the tradition of tea in pubs. Part of that is just about finding a warm and cozy place when it's cold and rainy outside.
You're making me crave a cuppa right now.
Well, there you go.
Eh.
But speaking of the weather, we have to talk about climate change.
Right, because that's a global issue, but it's definitely affecting Britain in specific ways, right?
For sure. One of the biggest concerns is rising sea levels. Areas like East Anglia, they're particularly vulnerable to flooding. But there's also a real push to invest in renewable energy. Things like offshore wind farms.
Right, like they've got going in the North Sea.
Exactly. So it's like they're adapting their relationship with the sea to meet these new challenges.
It's fascinating to think about, how something as big and as sort of ancient as the land and the weather are still influencing Britain today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've got the geography, we've got the climate. Now let's talk about history, because you've given us like centuries of history to try to understand.
We do have a lot to work with, though, Wayne.
We do. I mean, your overview starts with Stonehenge.
Right. Talk about ancient.
And it goes all the way to like Brexit and the present day. I mean, how do you even begin to sum up something like that?
It's tough, that's for sure. But one thing that kept striking me as I was putting it together was this idea of unification.
Unification. Okay, explain that.
Well, think about it. You've got all these different groups, coming together to eventually form what we know as Great Britain.
Hmm.
You've got the Romans who arrive in, 43 AD.
Right.
And they established Londinium. I mean, that's London as we know it today. And their infrastructure, their roads, their legal systems, I mean, some of it is still with us. Then you've got the Anglo-Saxons who come in waves.
Hmm.
And they're establishing their own kingdoms, their own culture.
Right, and they're followed by the Vikings, who are, raiding and sometimes settling. It's a lot of back and forth, isn't it?
It is. But then something really big happens. We're talking about the Norman Conquest in 1066.
Mm.
This wasn't just another invasion. It was a complete takeover of the English system.
Right, with William the Conqueror. He changes everything, doesn't he?
Exactly. He introduces this feudal system, a much more centralized form of government. And that really laid the foundation for what England and eventually Great Britain would become.
So that's a key turning point, the Norman conquest. And then after that, you're talking about the gradual merging of England, Scotland, and Wales.
Right. Yeah, that process took centuries, honestly. You've got the absorption of Wales into the kingdom in the 16th century, and then over 100 years later, you've got the active union with Scotland.
In 1707.
Mhm.
Right. And
Eh,
that's when we finally have this political entity called Great Britain.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that even though it was a union, it wasn't without its tensions. There were definitely those who felt like they were losing their identity, their autonomy. Those feelings haven't completely gone away, even today.
Right. Which is definitely something we're going to come back to. But I guess after the creation of Great Britain, you've got another massive shift, and that's the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, absolutely. That's when everything changes again. I mean, we're talking about a period of just incredible innovation. You've got the steam engine, the spinning jenny, all of these inventions that just transform how things are made. And Britain, they become the workshop of the world, right?
Wow. Right. And that economic power, I mean, it fuels the growth of the British Empire.
Yeah.
By the early 20th century, they're a global power, right? They've got colonies all over the world,
Exactly. They've got an empire on which the sun never sets, as they used to say.
which is all pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, from this small island nation to this massive global empire. But of course, it doesn't last forever.
Right. After World War II, you've got the process of decolonization. It's not always peaceful. It's often quite messy, but it's a huge turning point in British history.
And it really changes Britain's place in the world, doesn't it?
It does. It forces them to redefine themselves, to focus more on domestic issues. And that brings us to, I guess, a more recent turning point, which is the year 2000. You've got Tony Blair with his New Labour, and Britain decides to join the EU's single market.
So they're becoming more integrated with Europe, but they're also at the same time dealing with these questions of like regional identity.
Right.
You mentioned that they're giving more power to Scotland and Wales.
Right. They're devolving power. So you've got the Scottish Parliament, you've got the Welsh Assembly, and they're able to make decisions on things like education and healthcare. So it's like even as they're becoming more unified with Europe, they're also recognizing these internal divisions, these different identities.
It's complicated, but I think it leads us nicely into talking about the political structure of Britain as it stands today in 2025.
Right. So we've got this constitutional monarchy, King Charles III. He's the head of state.
But he doesn't actually, like, run the country.
He doesn't, no. The real power rests with Parliament, which meets in Westminster.
And Parliament, that's made up of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the Prime Minister, who is the head of the government, they're chosen from the party that holds the most seats in the House of Commons.
Yeah,
It's a parliamentary system.
right. But one thing that always confuses me about British politics is this idea of an unwritten constitution. What does that even mean?
It's a bit strange, I know, especially if you're used to countries like the U.S., which have a single document that lays out all the rules.
Yeah.
But in Britain, it's different. Their constitution, it's kind of scattered.
Scattered.
Yeah. It's made up of all sorts of things, like acts of parliament,
Sure.
legal precedents that have been set over the centuries.
So like court rulings and stuff.
Exactly. And even just traditions and conventions that have developed over time. So it's kind of this living document, you know.
Yeah.
It evolves, it changes, but it also means that things can be a little bit ambiguous sometimes.
I can imagine. So that must lead to a lot of debate. I mean, with everyone kind of interpreting things differently.
It definitely does. And that brings us, I think, to one of the biggest political upheavals in recent British history. I'm talking about Brexit.
Right, because everything we've been talking about unification and then devolution, it all kind of comes to a head with Brexit, doesn't it?
It really does. So you've got this referendum in 2016, and people vote by a very slim margin to leave the European Union, and that leads to Britain actually exiting the EU in 2020.
Which has caused a lot of, let's say, complications.
It has, yeah. One of the biggest challenges has been trying to figure out these new trade relationships. You know, now that they're not part of the single market, they've been trying to strengthen ties with the U.S., with countries in the Commonwealth, but it's been a really complex process.
And then there's the issue of the border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the EU. That's been a real headache, hasn't it?
It has. And it's still an ongoing issue. They're trying to work out these arrangements that'll keep trade flowing smoothly without creating a hard border.
Hmm.
But it's tricky. politically and practically.
Right, because you've got the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland, and you don't want to upset that delicate balance.
Exactly. So it's this really sensitive issue. And then on top of all of that, you've got the question of Scottish independence, which never really went away. But after Brexit, it's become even more prominent.
Right, because Scotland voted to stay in the EU, didn't they?
They did, yeah. And that's led a lot of people in Scotland to feel like, well, if England wants to leave, then maybe we should just go our own way.
And you mentioned that the polls in 2025 are showing a really tight split on the issue.
Yeah, it's almost 50-50. So it's very possible that Scotland could hold another independence referendum in the near future. And then there's Wales. They're not talking about full independence, but they are exploring the idea of having more autonomy, more control over their own affairs.
So it's like the whole question of what it means to be British is kind of up in the air right now.
It really is. And of course, you can't forget about England in all of this. They're the largest part of the UK population-wise, so they have a lot of influence on how things play out.
It's fascinating, but also a bit mind-boggling, all these moving parts.
Definitely keeps things interesting.
It does. Okay, so we've talked about the land, the history, the politics. What about the economy? Where does Britain stand economically in 2025?
Well, they're still one of the biggest economies in the world. But it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, honestly. I mean, they've had to adapt to a lot of changes over the years.
Right, because like you mentioned earlier, they were this manufacturing powerhouse during the Industrial Revolution. But that's not really the case anymore, is it?
No, it's not. By the year 2000, they'd already shifted to a more service-based economy. London, especially, became this global financial center, with banks and insurance companies and the stock exchange, and that was generating a lot of wealth.
Right, but then what happens? The 2008 financial crisis hits, right? And that must have really shaken things up.
Oh, it did. And they had to implement all these austerity measures, cutbacks in government spending. And that led to a lot of debate about whether it was the right approach, whether it was hurting ordinary people more than it was helping.
And then you add Brexit on top of all that. I mean, that must have caused a lot of economic uncertainty.
It definitely did. Suddenly they're having to renegotiate all these trade deals. There were supply chain issues, all sorts of disruptions. But they're also trying to find new opportunities, like they signed this trade deal with Australia in 2021.
So it's like a mixed bag, right? Challenges and opportunities.
Exactly. But the overall outlook, I'd say, is cautiously optimistic. They're projecting GDP growth of around 2 to 3% annually by 2025. And some of that is being driven by investments in new technology, like artificial intelligence.
Right, because you mentioned Manchester is becoming a bit of a tech hub, right?
It is, yeah. And then there's the green energy sector,
Yeah.
all those investments in wind farms and solar power. That's expected to create jobs and stimulate growth as well.
So there are some bright spots.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that there are some pretty stark regional differences, right?
And that's a big issue. The southeast of England, where London is, they're generally doing much better than other parts of the country, like the north, which was really hit hard by the decline of manufacturing.
It's like that gap between the haves and the have-nots is still a problem.
It is.
Yeah,
And it's something that the government is trying to address, but it's a complex issue.
I can imagine. Okay, so aside from all the hard economic data,
Yeah.
what about the other things that contribute to the British economy? You mentioned the creative arts, for example.
Oh, right. That's huge. I mean, think about it. You've got film franchises like Harry Potter, which have brought in billions.
Right, and musicians like Adele, who are global superstars.
Exactly. And then you've got the fashion industry, which is still really strong. All of this generates a lot of revenue and creates jobs.
It's easy to forget how much culture contributes to a country's economic well-being.
It really is.
Mhm.
And it's something that Britain has always excelled at.
Right, they've got this really strong cultural legacy.
They do.
Okay, so final question on the economy. What about unemployment?
Well, the overall unemployment rate is pretty low, around 4%.
Yeah.
But again, that masks some of the regional variations. There are definitely areas where unemployment is much higher.
It's like looking at any statistic about Britain. You have to remember that it's this really diverse country with a lot of different realities.
Exactly. There's no one single story that captures it all.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about society and culture in Britain in 2025. I mean, one of the things that struck me reading your overview is how multicultural Britain has become.
Oh, yeah. And it's really one of the things that defines contemporary Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got this mix of people from all over the world. And it's not just in London, it's in cities and towns across the country.
Right, you mentioned Birmingham and Glasgow as examples.
Yeah. And it's not just about demographics.
Yeah.
It's about how these different cultures have blended and influenced each other. Like, how curry is now considered one of the most popular dishes in Britain.
Yeah, that always kind of blows my mind.
Right. But it just shows you how much immigration has shaped what it means to be British today.
Right. And it's not just food, it's music, it's art, it's everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, you still have this strong sense of British identity,
Mm,
this sort of core set of values and traditions.
right. Because you mentioned things like Shakespeare, the Beatles, the BBC, all those icons of British culture.
Yeah, those are still really important touchstones, I think. And they're recognized globally, which is really interesting.
And then there's sport. I mean, can you even talk about Britain without talking about
Oh,
football?
absolutely. Football, cricket, rugby, these are all really central to British culture. And then there's the education system with its world-famous universities like Oxford and Cambridge.
Right, those are still considered like the gold standard, aren't they?
They are. But then, of course, you also have to talk about the class system, which is still very much a part of British society. There's this whole debate about private schools versus state schools and how that perpetuates inequality.
Right, and you mentioned Eton, which is like the ultimate symbol of elite education, right?
It is. And it's just one example of how, even though Britain has become more modern and multicultural, some of these traditional structures and hierarchies, they haven't completely gone away.
Right. And then on top of that, you've got all these other social challenges that Britain is facing in 2025. You mentioned the NHS, the National Health Service, which is under a lot of strain.
It is. It's this beloved institution, but it's struggling to keep up with demand, with an aging population,
Right.
with funding cuts.
And then there's the housing crisis, right?
Yeah. It's really hard for a lot of people, especially young people, to find affordable housing.
Mm.
And that's feeding into this sense of inequality, this feeling that the system isn't working for everyone.
And these are all issues that are being debated and protested, right? You mentioned the cost of living protests that have been happening.
Right. People are feeling squeezed, they're feeling left behind,
Yeah.
and they're making their voices heard.
It sounds like a really dynamic, but also quite tense social and political landscape.
It is, yeah. There's a lot going on.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap things up here, I guess the big question is, what does all of this mean for Great Britain in 2025? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Britain is at a crossroads in many ways. They're still dealing with the fallout from Brexit. The political landscape is shifting. There's the possibility of Scottish independence. And they're grappling with all these social and economic challenges.
It's a lot to process. But I think if we look back at everything we've talked about the geography, the history, the politics, it's clear that Britain has always been a country that's had to adapt.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they've gone from being this small island nation to a global empire and back again. They've weathered wars, revolutions, economic crises. They're resilient.
And they're still innovating. You mentioned those AI hubs in Cambridge, the renewable energy projects.
Right. And they're still producing world-class culture. Glastonbury is still going strong. They're making TV shows that everyone's watching.
So it's like they're this mix of like tradition and modernity. Yeah. And they're trying to find their place in this new globalized world.
Yeah. And they're doing it while facing some pretty serious headwinds. Like the NHS is struggling, their infrastructure needs updating, and the climate crisis, well, that's affecting everyone, but Britain is definitely feeling the effects.
Right. You mentioned the floods and the heat waves they've been experiencing.
Yeah, and that's just going to become more and more of a factor in the coming years.
So they've got their work cut out for them, but it sounds like they're up for the challenge.
They are. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out. What kind of role will they play in the world in the years to come? Will they be able to hold themselves together, or will they fracture?
So many questions. And it's not like we can predict the future.
We can't. But that's what makes it so interesting to watch.
It really is. Okay, well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, we hope you'll keep exploring the story of Great Britain, because it's a story that's still being written.